My name is Henry Thompson. I'm 78 years old, and my life changed forever the morning I found that golden retriever shivering under my favorite bench in Central Park. It was early November 2024, one of those crisp Manhattan mornings when the autumn leaves crunch under your feet and your breath makes little clouds in the air. I'd been sleeping on park benches for 3 years now, ever since my disability checks stopped covering rent in this city that seems designed to push people like me to the edges. I served 2 tours in Vietnam, came home to a country that didn't want to hear our stories, worked construction for 40 years until my back gave out, and somehow ended up part of that statistic nobody likes to talk about. One of the 32,182 veterans experiencing homelessness in America. But that morning, finding that scared golden retriever, everything started to shift in ways I never could have imagined. The dog was huddled against the wrought iron base of the bench near the Shakespeare Garden, his beautiful golden coat matted and dirty, his brown eyes holding that particular kind of fear that comes from being abandoned. He couldn't have been on the streets long. His collar was expensive leather, and despite the dirt, I could tell he was well fed and cared for until recently. "Hey there, boy," I said softly, extending my weathered hand toward him. "What are you doing out here all alone?" He lifted his head and looked at me with those soulful brown eyes that golden retrievers are famous for. There was intelligence there, and sadness, and something that looked like hope. He didn't run when I approached, which told me he was used to human kindness. I'd always been good with animals. Growing up on a farm in upstate New York before the war, I'd helped raise everything from horses to barn cats. Animals don't judge you by your clothes or your address, they judge you by your heart. And apparently, this beautiful dog saw something in mine worth trusting. "You hungry, buddy?" I asked, unwrapping the leftover sandwich I'd saved from yesterday's meal at the Holy Apostles Soup Kitchen. It was turkey and Swiss on whole wheat bread, better food than I'd eaten regularly in years before I started relying on the kindness of charity organizations. The dog approached cautiously, took the sandwich pieces gently from my hand, and ate with that polite way well-trained dogs have. This wasn't a street dog. This was somebody's beloved pet who had somehow ended up lost or abandoned in the most expensive city in America. "We're both out of place here, aren't we?" I said, settling back against the bench. The dog finished eating and, to my surprise, came and lay down next to my feet. The warmth of his body against my worn boots was the first real comfort I'd felt in months. Central Park in November is beautiful but cold. The tourists thin out, leaving the park to joggers, dog walkers, and people like me who have nowhere else to go. I'd chosen this particular area because it's quieter than the main walking paths, and the police don't hassle you as much if you keep a low profile and don't cause trouble. If you're finding this story as compelling as I hope you are, please subscribe to the channel. Stories like this need to be heard, and your support helps me keep sharing them. "What should I call you?" I asked the dog, who had settled in like he'd been waiting for me all his life. His collar had no tags, but the quality of the leather and the silver hardware suggested he came from money. "You look like a Buddy to me. Is that okay?" Buddy's tail thumped once against the ground, and I took that as agreement. Over the next few hours, as the park filled with the usual morning crowd, I noticed something interesting. Buddy would watch the joggers and dog walkers pass by, his ears alert, as if he was looking for someone specific. But when no one came, he'd settle back down next to me, loyal as any friend I'd ever had. Around 10 in the morning, I saw them for the first time. A black town car with tinted windows dropping off a boy who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. The kid was dressed in a uniform from one of those elite private schools. Navy blazer, khaki pants, expensive shoes. He had that particular posture that comes from privilege and confidence. But when he spotted Buddy from across the path, something in his expression changed. The boy stopped walking and stared at us for a long moment. Buddy had seen him too, and his whole body language shifted, ears up, tail wagging slightly, but he didn't get up from beside me. It was like he recognized the boy, but wasn't sure if he should be happy or worried about it. "Alexander," the driver called from the car. "You'll be late for school." The boy, Alexander, looked torn between coming over to us and getting back in the car. Finally, he chose the car, but not before giving us one long, meaningful look that told me there was more to this story. "You know that kid, don't you, buddy?" I asked after the town car disappeared into the traffic on Fifth Avenue. Buddy whined softly and put his head on my knee, as if the whole situation was too complicated to explain. That afternoon, I took Buddy with me to the soup kitchen on 9th Avenue. The volunteers there were used to seeing homeless people with dogs. Pets are often the only family people in my situation have left. Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd been ladling out soup for 20 years, smiled when she saw us. "New friend, Henry?" she asked. "Found him this morning. Somebody's missing a beautiful dog. He's gorgeous. Golden retriever, purebred from the looks of him. Expensive dog for someone like me to be taking care of. Maybe that's exactly why you're supposed to take care of him," she said, filling a bowl with fresh water for Buddy. "Sometimes the most valuable things come to us when we're least expecting them." That evening, as the sun set behind the Manhattan skyline and the park grew quiet, Buddy and I settled in for our first night together. I'd found a more sheltered spot near the conservatory garden, where the maintenance crews were less likely to move us along. "I don't have much to offer you, boy," I told him, as I spread out the sleeping bag I'd gotten from a homeless services outreach worker. "Just some food when I can spare it, and a warm body to sleep next to. But I promise you this, as long as you want to stay with me, I'll do everything I can to take care of you." Buddy curled up against me, his golden fur providing warmth, and his steady breathing providing comfort I hadn't realized I was missing. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't feel completely alone in the world. But as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't stop thinking about that boy in the expensive uniform. There had been recognition in both their eyes, and something told me this wasn't the last we'd see of young Alexander. The city never really sleeps, but Central Park gets as close to quiet as Manhattan ever does. Police sirens wailed in the distance, mixing with the sound of late-night traffic and the occasional laugh from people walking home from fancy restaurants and Broadway shows. This was the New York most people never see, the version that exists after midnight, when the city belongs to insomniacs, shift workers, and people like me who don't have anywhere else to go. "Tomorrow we'll figure this out," I whispered to Buddy, who was already fast asleep with his head on my arm. "Whatever brought you to me, whatever brought me to you, we'll figure it out together." I'd been part of that grim statistic of veteran homelessness for 3 years, invisible to most of the millions of people who call New York home. But something told me that finding Buddy was going to change that invisibility in ways I couldn't yet imagine. 3 days passed before I saw Alexander again, and in that time, Buddy and I had settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Every morning, we'd walk the quieter paths of Central Park while the city woke up around us. Buddy was an excellent companion, well-trained, gentle, and somehow intuitive about which areas were safe for us and which ones attracted too much attention from park security. I'd been homeless for 3 years, but I'd never had a dog before. The responsibility was both challenging and oddly comforting. Having something that depended on me gave me a reason to get up each morning beyond just survival. Buddy needed food, water, exercise, and care, and somehow meeting his needs made my own situation feel less hopeless. It was a Thursday morning, crisp and clear, when the Blacktown car pulled up again. This time, instead of just looking, Alexander actually walked over to us. He moved with the confident stride of someone raised with privilege, but I could see uncertainty in his eyes as he approached our bench near the sheep meadow. "Excuse me, sir," he said, and his voice had that particular accent that comes from expensive education and careful enunciation. "Is that your dog?" "He is now," I replied carefully. I'd learned that when dealing with wealthy people, honesty was usually the best policy, but so was being prepared for anything. "Found him 3 days ago, right here in the park. Somebody abandoned him, looks like." Alexander's face went through a series of emotions, relief, sadness, and something that might have been guilt. He knelt down, and Buddy immediately went to him, tail wagging, clearly recognizing someone he knew and loved. His name is Buddy, the boy said softly, scratching behind the dog's ears in exactly the right spot. He's been missing for almost 2 weeks. My parents, they think he ran away, but he trailed off, and I could see there was more to the story. But what, son? Alexander looked up at me, and I saw something in his 12-year-old eyes that reminded me of soldiers I'd known in Vietnam, the look of someone carrying guilt they shouldn't have to carry. They were going to give him away. My mom said he was too much responsibility, and my dad said we traveled too much to have a dog. They found a family upstate who wanted him, but he paused, stroking Buddy's golden fur. I couldn't let them take him away, so I let him out of our apartment. I thought maybe he'd just hide in the park until they changed their minds. If this story is touching your heart, like it's touching mine, please hit that subscribe button. These are the stories that remind us what really matters in life. The honesty of his confession hit me hard. This kid had risked everything to save his dog, not realizing that Central Park in November could be dangerous for a pampered pet. But Buddy had found me instead, and somehow we'd all ended up exactly where we needed to be. What's your full name, Alexander? Alexander Morrison. My dad is David Morrison. He works for Goldman Sachs. My mom is Catherine Morrison. She's on the board of directors for several charities. He said this matter-of-factly, the way kids do when they're used to their parents' accomplishments opening doors. Morrison. I'd heard that name before, probably in the financial pages of newspapers I'd found in park trash cans. Old habits die hard. Even living on the streets, I still tried to keep up with current events. And where do you go to school? The Pemberton Academy. It's on the Upper East Side. He looked uncomfortable talking about himself. Mr. Thompson, Henry Thompson. I'm a Vietnam veteran, and I've been living in the park for a few years now. Living in the park? His eyes widened. Like sleeping here? That's right, son. Sometimes life takes turns you don't expect. Alexander processed this information with the seriousness that some kids have, the ones who think more deeply than their peers. Are you homeless because of the war? The directness of children can be both brutal and refreshing. Partly. The war changed a lot of things for guys like me. But there were other factors too. Life's complicated, Alexander. Alexander! The sharp voice of his driver cut through our conversation. You need to get to school. Alexander stood up reluctantly. Mr. Thompson, can I come see Buddy again? Maybe bring him some proper dog food. That would be appreciated, son. We're usually here in the mornings, around this time. I have to go to school now, but I could come after school. Would that be okay? I looked at this privileged kid who'd risked his parents' anger to save his dog, and who was now worried about a homeless veteran he'd just met. That would be fine, Alexander. He ran back to the car, but turned around once to wave at Buddy, who was watching him go with those expressive brown eyes. That afternoon, true to his word, Alexander appeared around 4 o'clock. He'd changed out of his school uniform into expensive casual clothes. Designer jeans, a North Face jacket that probably cost more than I spent on food in a month. But he was carrying a large bag from a high-end pet store. I brought supplies, he announced, unpacking the bag like it was Christmas morning. Premium dog food, treats, a new leash, a water bowl, even a dog bed that looked more comfortable than my sleeping bag. Alexander, this is too much. Your parents are going to notice if you spend this kind of money. I have an allowance, he said simply, and besides, it's for Buddy. For the next hour, we sat on the bench while Alexander told me about his school, his parents' busy schedules, and how lonely he'd been since they'd started talking about giving Buddy away. The dog sat contentedly between us, clearly happy to have his 2 favorite people in the same place. Mr. Thompson, Alexander said as the sun began to set, can I ask you something personal? Sure. Do you have any family? People who worry about you? The question caught me off guard. I have a sister in Oregon. We exchange Christmas cards. She has her own family, her own problems. And I had friends from the service, but we've lost touch over the years. Don't you get lonely? Every day, son. Every day. Alexander was quiet for a moment. I get lonely too. Even though I live in a penthouse and go to the best school and have everything I could want, I still get lonely. Friends, If this conversation between a homeless veteran and a wealthy child is resonating with you, please share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Loneliness doesn't care how much money you have, I told him. Some of the loneliest people I've ever known had everything money could buy. Is that why you take such good care of Buddy? Because you understand what it's like to need someone? This kid was too perceptive for his own good. Maybe. Or maybe Buddy takes care of me just as much as I take care of him. I think, Alexander said thoughtfully, that's exactly what I was hoping would happen when I let him go in the park. We sat in comfortable silence as the park around us shifted from afternoon to evening. Dog walkers headed home, joggers finished their runs, and the city's rhythm changed from day to night. Alexander checked his expensive watch, probably worth more than I'd made in my last year of construction work. I have to go home for dinner, he said reluctantly, but can I come back tomorrow? We'll be here. As he packed up his school bag, Alexander hesitated. Mr. Thompson, thank you for taking care of Buddy. And thank you for not turning me into my parents when you found out he was mine. Sometimes the right thing to do isn't the same as the legal thing to do, son. He smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen on his face. My grandmother used to say that. She said the best people are the ones who do what's right, even when it's hard. After he left, I looked down at Buddy, who was already settling in for the night on his new bed. What do you think, boy? Are we doing the right thing here? Buddy looked up at me with those wise brown eyes and thumped his tail once against his bed. I took that as approval. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag with Buddy comfortable on his new bed beside me, I thought about the unexpected turns life can take. 3 days ago, I was just another invisible homeless veteran. Now I was part of something bigger, a conspiracy of kindness involving a guilty boy, a beloved dog, and an old soldier who'd forgotten what it felt like to be needed. The city's night sounds surrounded us, sirens, traffic, the distant sound of music from some rooftop party where people who'd never worried about where their next meal was coming from danced the night away. But for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't bitter about the contrast. I was just grateful for the warmth of a loyal dog and the promise of seeing a lonely boy's face light up when he visited us tomorrow. 2 weeks into our routine, Alexander started staying longer each afternoon, and our conversations grew deeper than I ever expected from a 12-year-old. He'd arrive after school, still wearing his Pemberton Academy uniform, then spend an hour with Buddy and me before heading home to his family's penthouse on Fifth Avenue. Those daily visits became the highlight of my days, and I could tell they meant just as much to Alexander. The boy was clearly struggling with something beyond just missing his dog. The more time we spent together, the more I realized that wealth hadn't protected Alexander from the particular kind of pain that comes from feeling invisible in your own family. His parents loved him, he assured me, but their love seemed to come with conditions and schedules that left little room for the actual kid behind all their expectations. They want me to be perfect, he told me one afternoon as we watched Buddy chase leaves in the wind. Perfect grades, perfect behavior, perfect college applications when I'm older. Sometimes I think they love the idea of me more than they love me. That's a heavy burden for someone your age to carry, I said. Do you think I'm a bad person for lying to them about Buddy? I've been thinking about this question myself. I think you're a 12-year-old kid who loves his dog and was scared of losing him. Sometimes good people do things that aren't technically right because they're trying to protect something they love. Is that what you did in the war? If you're invested in Henry and Alexander's growing friendship, please subscribe to our channel. Stories about unlikely connections need to be shared. The question surprised me. Most people, even adults, didn't ask veterans direct questions about combat. Sometimes, yes. War puts you in impossible situations where all the choices are bad and you have to pick the least bad one. Do you have nightmares about it? Sometimes. I didn't tell him that the nightmares had gotten worse since I'd been living on the streets, or that Buddy's presence next to me at night was the only thing that helped me sleep through them. I have nightmares sometimes too, Alexander said quietly. Not about war, but about disappointing people. about not being good enough. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of us lost in our own thoughts, while Buddy dozed in the afternoon sun. The park was busy with the usual crowd: joggers, dog walkers, nannies pushing expensive strollers, tourists taking photos of the skyline visible through the trees. "Mr. Thompson," Alexander said suddenly, "would you like to see where I live?" The offer caught me off guard. "Son, I don't think that's such a good idea. Your parents, they're in London for a financial conference, won't be back until Sunday. It's just me and Eleanor, our housekeeper, and she likes dogs." I looked down at my worn clothes, then at Alexander in his pressed school uniform. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. "Alexander, I appreciate the invitation, but I don't exactly fit in with your crowd." "You fit with me," he said simply. "And besides, Buddy deserves to see his old home, don't you think?" Buddy, as if understanding the conversation, stood up and wagged his tail hopefully. An hour later, I found myself in the marble lobby of one of Fifth Avenue's most exclusive buildings, feeling more out of place than I had since my first day in Vietnam. The doorman, a professionally polite man in his 50s, looked at me with poorly concealed concern, until Alexander explained I was a family friend visiting with Buddy. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like ascending to another planet. Alexander chatted nervously about school, while Buddy sat perfectly at my feet, as if he remembered the proper behavior expected in such places. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped into a world I'd only seen in movies. The penthouse stretched out like something from Architectural Digest, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, modern art on the walls, furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars. But what struck me most was how empty it felt, despite all the luxury. "This is where I grew up," Alexander said, and there was something almost apologetic in his tone. Buddy immediately ran to a spot by the windows and lay down, clearly remembering his favorite place to watch the park below. From 42 floors up, Central Park looked like a postcard, and I could actually see the area where Buddy and I had been sleeping. "Elena!" Alexander called out. "I brought a friend!" Elena appeared from what I assumed was the kitchen, a kind-faced woman in her 40s who smiled warmly when she saw Buddy. "Buddy, ¿dónde has estado, mi amor?" She knelt down to hug the dog, then looked at me with curiosity, but no judgment. "Elena, this is Mr. Thompson. He's been taking care of Buddy." "Thank you," she said simply, and the gratitude in her voice was genuine. "I have been so worried about this dog. I told Mr. and Mrs. Morrison they should not give him away, but—" She shrugged expressively. "Elena practically raised me," Alexander explained. "She's more family than employee." Elena disappeared and returned with a plate of food that smelled better than anything I'd eaten in months. Rice and beans and what looked like homemade bread. "You are too thin," she said, setting the plate in front of me. "Eat." As I ate, trying to remember my table manners from a lifetime ago, Alexander gave me a tour of the penthouse. His bedroom alone was bigger than most apartments I'd lived in, filled with books, expensive electronics, and a window seat overlooking Central Park, where he said he used to sit with Buddy for hours. "I would sit here and watch people in the park," he told me. I always wondered what their lives were like, especially the people who seemed to live there. I never imagined I'd actually meet one of them. "And what did you imagine about us?" "I thought you must be very sad all the time." "But you don't seem sad exactly. You seem, I don't know, like you figured out something the rest of us haven't." This conversation is getting to the heart of what really matters in life. If you're feeling it too, hit that like button and let us know in the comments. What do you think I've figured out? That happiness doesn't come from having things. It comes from connections, maybe, from caring about something outside yourself. This kid continued to amaze me with his insights. You might be onto something there, Alexander. We spent the rest of the afternoon on the terrace, 42 floors above the city, talking about everything and nothing while Buddy alternated between us, clearly happy to have his two favorite people in the same place. Alexander asked about my childhood, my time in the service, my years in construction. I asked about his school, his friends, his dreams for the future. "I want to do something that matters," he told me as the sun began to set over Manhattan. "My parents expect me to go into finance like my dad, but I want to help people, real people, not just other rich people." "What kind of help?" "I don't know yet. Maybe work with homeless veterans. After meeting you, I've been reading about it. Did you know there are over 30,000 veterans experiencing homelessness in America?" "I'm part of that statistic, son." "But you shouldn't be. You served our country. You deserve better." The passion in his voice reminded me why I'd liked him from the first day we met. Here was a kid who could have anything he wanted, but what he wanted was to make the world more fair. As evening approached and it was time for me to head back to the park, Elena packed enough food for several days and insisted I take it for Buddy. Alexander walked us to the elevator, clearly reluctant to say goodbye. "Mr. Thompson," he said as we waited for the elevator, "spending time with you and taking care of Buddy is the happiest I've been in a long time." "Me too, son. When my parents come back on Sunday, I'm going to tell them the truth about Buddy. About letting him go, about you taking care of him, about everything. Are you sure that's wise?" "I'm sure it's right. And you taught me that sometimes the right thing and the wise thing are the same thing." As Buddy and I rode the elevator down from the clouds to the street level, I reflected on the strange turns my life had taken. A month ago, I was just another invisible homeless veteran. Now I was part of a family, an unusual family, but a real one nonetheless. That night, as Buddy and I settled into our spot in the park, I could see lights twinkling in the building where Alexander lived. Somewhere up there, a lonely boy was probably looking down at the park, thinking about friendship and responsibility and the courage it takes to tell the truth. "Tomorrow's going to be interesting, boy," I told Buddy, who was already settled on his bed with a belly full of Elena's good cooking. He looked at me with those wise brown eyes and thumped his tail once, as if to say, "Bring it on, old man. We're ready for whatever comes next." Alexander didn't show up on Sunday, and I knew that meant he was having the conversation with his parents that we'd both been dreading. Buddy seemed to sense the tension, staying closer to me than usual and watching the path where Alexander normally appeared with an alertness that broke my heart. By Monday afternoon, when there was still no sign of the boy, I was genuinely worried. In the 2 weeks since we'd become friends, Alexander had never missed a day without letting me know in advance. The park felt different without his cheerful chatter, and the way Buddy's entire demeanor changed when he saw his young friend approaching. Tuesday morning brought unseasonably cold weather and the first real frost of the season. I was sharing my breakfast with Buddy when I saw them approaching. Alexander walking slowly beside a tall man in an expensive coat who could only be his father. Even from a distance, I could tell this wasn't going to be a friendly social call. David Morrison looked exactly like what I'd imagined, successful, confident, and currently very unhappy. He moved with the purposeful stride of someone used to controlling every situation. But there was something in his posture that suggested he wasn't entirely sure how to handle this particular problem. "Mr. Thompson?" David Morrison extended his hand with the automatic courtesy of someone raised with good manners, but his eyes were measuring, evaluating. "I'm David Morrison, Alexander's father." "Mr. Morrison." I stood to shake his hand, conscious of the contrast between his tailored coat and my layered thrift store clothes. "Alexander's told me a lot about you. He's told me quite a bit about you as well." Morrison's tone was carefully neutral, but I could hear the underlying tension. "Alexander, why don't you say hello to Buddy while Mr. Thompson and I have a conversation?" Alexander shot me a worried look before kneeling down to greet Buddy, who was practically vibrating with excitement at seeing his boy again. Whatever conversation Alexander had had with his parents, it was clear the outcome wasn't entirely resolved. "Mr. Thompson," Morrison began, "I understand you've been caring for our dog for the past few weeks." "That's right. Found him in the park, scared and hungry. Been taking care of him since." "And you knew he belonged to Alexander?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for, not at first, But yes, after a few days it became clear they knew each other. And you didn't think to contact us, to let us know our son's dog was safe? I looked over at Alexander, who was watching our conversation with the intensity of someone whose whole world might be about to change. Mr. Morrison, can I be frank with you? Please. Your son let that dog go on purpose because he thought you were going to give him away to strangers. A 12-year-old boy was so desperate to save his best friend that he risked everything, including his parents' trust. That tells me this isn't really about a lost dog. It's about a kid who felt like he had no other choice. Morrison's expression shifted, and for a moment I saw past the Wall Street executive to the father who was genuinely struggling with a difficult situation. If you're as invested in this confrontation as I am, please subscribe to follow how this family works through their crisis. Alexander told us what he did, Morrison said quietly. He also told us about the friendship he's developed with you. That's actually why I'm here. I figured you'd want to take Buddy home and tell Alexander to stay away from the homeless veteran. That's what I thought I'd want too. Morrison looked over at his son, who was now sitting on the ground with Buddy's head in his lap. But Alexander spent 2 hours on Sunday explaining to his mother and me why that would be exactly the wrong thing to do. This wasn't the conversation I'd been expecting. What do you mean? He told us that meeting you has been the most important thing that's happened to him in years, that you've taught him things about character and integrity that we've been failing to teach him. That you've shown him what it means to take responsibility for someone else's welfare without expecting anything in return. Morrison paused, watching as Alexander whispered something to Buddy that made the dog's tail wag furiously. He also told us that we've been so focused on giving him opportunities and advantages that we forgot to give him our time and attention. That he was lonely enough to risk everything to save his dog because the dog was the only living thing that seemed to genuinely need him. The honesty in Morrison's voice surprised me. That's a lot for a 12-year-old to articulate. Alexander has always been mature for his age, maybe too mature. Morrison turned back to me. Mr. Thompson, I have a proposition for you. I'm listening. My wife and I travel extensively for work. Alexander spends a lot of time with Elena, our housekeeper, or alone. He's told us that the happiest part of his day is the time he spends here with you and Buddy. Morrison reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is a formal agreement. We'd like to hire you as Buddy's primary caregiver and Alexander's, well, let's call it an informal mentor. You'd have access to a small apartment we own near the park, a regular salary, and full responsibility for Buddy's care. I stared at the paper, not quite believing what I was hearing. Mr. Morrison, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure I'm the right person for this kind of responsibility. I'm homeless. I struggle with nightmares from the war. I'm not exactly role model material. Mr. Thompson, Morrison said, do you know what Alexander told us when we asked him what he'd learned from spending time with you? What? He said you taught him that a person's worth isn't measured by what they have, but by what they give. That honor doesn't come from success, but from doing the right thing even when it's difficult. That real strength isn't about avoiding problems, but about facing them honestly. Morrison looked directly at me. Those are lessons I wish I'd learned at his age. Lessons I'm not sure Catherine and I were equipped to teach him. Alexander had finished his reunion with Buddy and was now standing close enough to hear our conversation, his expression hopeful but trying not to show it. There's one more thing, Morrison continued. Alexander has asked if he can spend his winter break volunteering at organizations that help homeless veterans. He wants to understand the challenges people like you face, and he wants to help solve them. Mr. Morrison, I don't need charity. It's not charity, Mr. Thompson. It's employment. And maybe, if we're very lucky, it's the beginning of Alexander learning what it really means to be a responsible, compassionate adult. I looked at Alexander, who was watching me with those earnest eyes that had convinced me to trust him from the first day we met. What do you think about all this, son? I think, Alexander said carefully, that Buddy brought us together for a reason. And I think that reason was bigger than just making sure he had someone to take care of him. This transformation is exactly the kind of story that gives me hope for humanity. If you're feeling that too, please share this video with someone who needs to hear it. I need some time to think about this, I said finally. Of course, Morrison replied. But Mr. Thompson, Alexander is right about one thing. Meeting you has changed our family in ways we didn't expect. Whatever you decide, we're grateful for what you've already done. That evening, as Buddy and I settled into our usual spot in the park, I found myself staring up at the lights in Morrison's building and thinking about second chances. At 78, I'd assumed my life was essentially over, that I'd made my mistakes, served my time, and was just running out the clock until the end. But here was a 12-year-old boy offering me something I'd never expected to have again: purpose, family, and the chance to make a difference in someone else's life. What do you think, boy? I asked Buddy, who was chewing contentedly on one of the premium treats Alexander had brought him. Are we ready to trust them? Ready to become part of a family again? Buddy looked up at me with those wise brown eyes and thumped his tail twice, the most enthusiastic endorsement I'd gotten from him since the day I'd shared my first sandwich. Maybe it was time to take a leap of faith. 3 weeks after David Morrison made his offer, I was sitting in the small apartment he'd provided, watching Buddy sleep in a real dog bed while I tried to process how completely my life had changed. The apartment was nothing fancy, a studio with a kitchenette and a bathroom with actual hot water. But after 3 years of park benches and soup kitchens, it felt like a palace. The transition hadn't been without challenges. After decades of military discipline followed by years of survival mode, adjusting to a structured schedule and specific responsibilities took more effort than I'd anticipated. But Alexander's enthusiasm for our new arrangement made every difficulty worthwhile. Mr. Thompson! Alexander's voice called from the hallway, followed by the sound of keys in the lock. We'd established a routine where he came to the apartment every day after school, ostensibly to help with Buddy's care, but really because both of us enjoyed the company. In here, son, I called back, closing the book I'd been reading, a biography of other Vietnam veterans that Alexander had brought me from his school library. Alexander burst through the door with his usual energy, still wearing his Pemberton Academy uniform, but with his tie loosened and his backpack slung over one shoulder. Buddy immediately jumped up to greet him, tail wagging so hard his entire back end moved with it. How was school today? I asked, the same question I'd been asking every afternoon for 3 weeks. Good, but I have something exciting to tell you. Alexander dropped his backpack and settled cross-legged on the floor so Buddy could properly welcome him home. I talked to my English teacher, Mrs. Patterson, about your experiences in Vietnam, and she wants to know if you'd be willing to come speak to our class. The suggestion caught me off guard. Alexander, I'm not sure that's such a good idea. Your classmates come from a very different world than I do. That's exactly why it would be good for them to hear your story. Alexander's eyes lit up with the passion he got when he was excited about an idea. Mrs. Patterson says that hearing from people who've actually lived through historical events is more valuable than just reading about them in textbooks. What would I talk about? Your life, growing up on a farm, getting drafted, what the war was actually like, coming home, working construction, everything that led to you living in the park. Alexander paused, his expression becoming more serious. And about what it's like to be a homeless veteran in America today. If you're inspired by Alexander's desire to educate his privileged classmates about real-world experiences, please subscribe to see how this story continues to unfold. I'd been thinking a lot about my responsibility to Alexander since accepting his family's offer. It wasn't just about caring for Buddy or providing companionship. It was about helping shape a young man who would inherit tremendous privilege and wanted to use it responsibly. I'm not much of a public speaker, son. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be honest. That's what you taught me, remember? That honesty is more valuable than being impressive. Over the next week, Alexander helped me prepare for the class presentation. We went through old photo albums I'd salvaged from my apartment before I'd become homeless. Pictures of my childhood farm, my unit in Vietnam, construction projects I'd worked on over the decades. Alexander was fascinated by each image, asking questions that helped me see my own life story as something worth sharing. "Mr. Thompson," he said one afternoon as we sorted through the photos, "do you ever regret the choices you made?" "Which choices?" "Enlisting in the military, going to Vietnam, working construction instead of going to college after the war." It was a thoughtful question from a kid whose entire life had been structured around maximizing opportunities and avoiding regrets. "I don't regret serving my country, even though the war was complicated and painful. I don't regret working construction. It was honest work, and I was good at it. I do regret not staying in touch with more people from my old life, not building stronger relationships that might have helped me when things got difficult." "Is that why you were willing to become friends with me? Because you didn't want to make that mistake again?" "Partly, but mainly because you're a good kid who deserves to have adults in his life who see you for who you really are, not just who your parents want you to become." Alexander smiled. "That's exactly the kind of thing you should tell my classmates." The morning of the presentation, I was more nervous than I'd been since my first day in combat. David Morrison had offered to have his driver take me to the school, but I'd chosen to take the subway instead, partly to save money, but mostly because riding the subway felt more authentic to the story I was there to tell. The Pemberton Academy was everything I'd expected: impressive brick buildings, perfectly maintained grounds, students who moved with the confidence that comes from knowing they're being prepared for lives of privilege and influence. Alexander met me at the entrance, clearly excited and a little nervous himself. "Are you ready for this?" he asked as we walked toward the classroom. "As ready as I'll ever be." Mrs. Patterson turned out to be a woman in her 50s who greeted me with warmth and genuine interest in what I had to share. The classroom was filled with 24 students who looked like younger versions of Alexander, well-dressed, well-educated, and probably unaccustomed to hearing from someone like me. "Students," Mrs. Patterson began, "I'd like you to welcome Mr. Henry Thompson, who has agreed to share his experiences as a Vietnam veteran and help us understand some of the challenges facing homeless veterans in America today." I stood at the front of the classroom, looking at 24 faces that represented the future leaders of America, and tried to figure out where to begin. "How many of you have ever met a homeless person?" I asked. About half the hands in the room went up. "How many of you have ever had a conversation with a homeless person?" Only 3 hands remained raised, including Alexander's. "I want to tell you a story about how I went from being a farm kid in upstate New York to being a homeless veteran sleeping in Central Park. But more importantly, I want to tell you about how your classmate Alexander changed my life, and maybe how that experience changed his life too. And this moment of education and bridge building between different worlds is exactly why these stories matter. If you agree, please share this video with an educator in your life." For the next 40 minutes, I told them about growing up poor but happy on a dairy farm, being drafted at 19, fighting in a war most Americans wanted to forget, coming home to a country that treated veterans with suspicion rather than gratitude. I told them about 40 years of construction work, the back injury that ended my career, the gradual slide from apartment to cheaper apartment to no apartment at all. And then I told them about finding Buddy in Central Park and how a 12-year-old boy's love for his dog had led to a friendship that saved both of us from loneliness. The questions afterward were thoughtful and genuine. These kids wanted to understand how someone could serve their country honorably and still end up homeless. They wanted to know what could be done to help veterans transition back to civilian life. They wanted to know how their generation could do better. "Mr. Thompson," asked a girl named Sarah, "what's the most important thing you want us to remember from your story?" "That everyone has a story worth knowing, that people become homeless for reasons that could happen to anyone, and that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything." A boy named Michael raised his hand. How did meeting Alexander change your life? Alexander saw me as a person instead of a problem. He didn't try to fix me or save me. He just treated me with respect and dignity. Sometimes that's all any of us really need. After the presentation, several students came up to ask more questions or to share their own thoughts about homelessness and veteran affairs. Alexander stood nearby, beaming with pride, and I realized that watching me speak to his classmates had been as meaningful for him as giving the presentation had been for me. "How do you think that went?" I asked Alexander as we walked back toward the subway station. "I think you opened some minds today, and I think some of my classmates are going to go home and have very different conversations with their parents tonight." "And what about you? Any regrets about introducing your homeless friend to your privileged classmates?" Alexander stopped walking and looked at me seriously. "Mr. Thompson, you're not my homeless friend. You're my friend who used to be homeless. There's a difference." That night, as Buddy and I settled into our comfortable apartment, I reflected on how much both Alexander and I had grown over the past month. He was learning that privilege comes with responsibility, and I was learning that my experiences, even the painful ones, had value beyond just surviving them. Tomorrow, Alexander wanted to take me to visit the VA Medical Center to learn more about services available to homeless veterans. Next week, his mother had arranged for us to tour a transitional housing program her charity supported. The boy was turning our friendship into an education about how to make a real difference in the world. "We're not just taking care of each other anymore, boy," I told Buddy as he settled onto his bed. "We're building something bigger, something that might actually help other people." Buddy looked at me with those wise golden eyes and thumped his tail twice, his way of saying he approved of our expanding mission. 6 months after I'd found Buddy shivering under that park bench, my life had transformed in ways I never could have imagined when I was just another invisible homeless veteran surviving day to day in Central Park. But the real transformation wasn't in my living situation or my relationship with the Morrison family. It was in the purpose I'd rediscovered and the impact Alexander and I were making together. It was a warm spring morning in May, and Alexander and I were standing in front of the newly opened Veterans Transition Center on the Upper West Side. The building had been funded partially by Catherine Morrison's charitable foundation and staffed with counselors, job placement specialists, and housing coordinators, specifically trained to help homeless veterans navigate the complex process of rebuilding their lives. "Mr. Thompson," said Sarah Chen, the center's director, "we have 3 new veterans checking in today, and they specifically requested to speak with you." This had become a regular part of my week, talking to newly arrived veterans about my own experience and helping them understand that homelessness wasn't a permanent condition, just a temporary situation that could be overcome with the right support and determination. Alexander stood beside me, dressed in his weekend clothes instead of his school uniform, carrying a clipboard with the volunteer schedule he'd helped create. At 13, he'd become the center's youngest regular volunteer, and his enthusiasm for helping others had inspired several of his classmates to join him. "Mr. Thompson," Alexander said, checking his notes, "after we meet with the new arrivals, we have that interview with the documentary filmmaker, and then Mrs. Patterson wants us to review the presentation slides for next week's assembly." Our story had attracted attention beyond Alexander's school. A filmmaker was creating a documentary about unlikely friendships and their power to create social change. Mrs. Patterson had invited us to speak at Pemberton Academy's annual community service assembly, where we'd be addressing the entire school about homelessness and veteran affairs. Friends, if you're amazed by how far Henry and Alexander have come together, please subscribe to follow more stories of transformation and hope. "How are you feeling about speaking to the whole school?" I asked Alexander as we walked toward the center's main meeting room. "Excited," he said immediately. "A little nervous, but mostly excited. Do you know what the best part is?" "What?" 5 of my classmates have convinced their parents to either donate to veteran services or volunteer with homeless outreach programs. And 3 seniors are planning to study social work or public policy in college because of your presentation. The impact had gone beyond his immediate classmates. David Morrison had started a foundation specifically focused on veteran housing initiatives. Catherine had redirected some of her charitable work toward programs that addressed veteran homelessness. Even Eleanor, the housekeeper who'd become like family to all of us, volunteered at the soup kitchen where I'd once gotten my own meals. We spent the morning with 3 new veterans. Marcus, a 34-year-old Marine who'd lost his apartment after struggling with PTSD, Robert, a 52-year-old Army veteran whose disability benefits hadn't kept up with rising rent costs, and Jennifer, a 28-year-old Navy veteran who'd been living in her car for 6 weeks after being evicted. I knew their stories because I'd lived a version of each one. The shame of needing help after years of independence. The complexity of navigating bureaucratic systems while dealing with mental health challenges. The exhaustion of constantly worrying about basic survival needs. The hardest part, I told them, isn't asking for help. It's accepting that you deserve help. That serving your country means something, that your life has value even when everything feels hopeless. How did you get from sleeping in Central Park to, "Oh, this," Marcus asked, gesturing at the comfortable meeting room and the resources visible throughout the center. A 12-year-old boy and a golden retriever reminded me that I was still capable of caring for someone else. And once I remembered that, I started remembering other things I'd forgotten. Like my own worth, my own strength, my own ability to contribute to something bigger than just my own survival. Alexander had been quietly listening, but now he spoke up. "Mr. Thompson taught me that helping people isn't about fixing them. It's about seeing them as they really are and supporting them while they fix themselves." After our session with the new veterans, Alexander and I walked through Central Park toward the spot where I'd first found Buddy. It had become a monthly ritual, returning to the place where our friendship began, bringing Buddy back to run in the areas where he'd once been homeless too. Buddy, now sleek and healthy and wearing a collar with both my name and Alexander's on the tags, ran ahead of us with the joy of a dog who knew he was loved and secure. Watching him play, it was hard to believe he'd ever been the scared, hungry animal I'd discovered 6 months ago. "Mr. Thompson," Alexander said as we sat on the same bench where I'd first offered Buddy half of my sandwich, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't found him that day?" "Every day," I admitted. "I think I would have kept surviving, but I wouldn't have started living again. Finding Buddy led me to you, and knowing you reminded me that I still had something valuable to offer the world. I think about it too. If I hadn't let Buddy go, if you hadn't found him, if we hadn't become friends, I'd still be that lonely kid who had everything except what actually mattered." Alexander had grown in the past 6 months, not just physically, but in confidence and purpose. He'd started a Veterans Awareness Club at his school, organized fundraisers for homeless services, and convinced several of his wealthy classmates' families to get involved in veterans' issues. But more importantly, he'd learned to use his privilege as a tool for helping others, rather than just as a source of personal comfort. "Alexander," I said, "I want you to know that being part of your family has been one of the greatest honors of my life. Not just because of the apartment or the job or the security, but because you've given me the chance to be useful again, to matter to someone. You've always mattered, Mr. Thompson. Even when you were sleeping in the park, even when you thought nobody cared about you, you mattered. This moment of mutual gratitude represents everything beautiful about human connection. If this story has touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today." That afternoon, we met with the documentary filmmaker in the small office space that had been set up for me at the Veterans Transition Center. The filmmaker, a woman named Lisa Rodriguez, was creating a series about Americans who'd found ways to bridge social and economic divides. "What I find most remarkable about your story," she said, "is how it demonstrates that the most meaningful help often comes not from institutions or programs, but from human connection. Henry, You didn't need professional training to help Alexander understand empathy and social responsibility. And Alexander, you didn't need a degree in social work to help Henry rediscover his purpose. I think, Alexander said thoughtfully, that's because we weren't trying to help each other at first. We were just trying to take care of Buddy together. The helping happened naturally because we started caring about each other. Lisa nodded, making notes. And now you're both using that experience to help other people. Henry, you're mentoring newly homeless veterans. And Alexander, you're educating your peers about social issues they might never have encountered otherwise. The goal was never to create a program or start a movement, I said. We just wanted to make sure Buddy was safe and loved. Everything else grew from that. But it did become something bigger, Alexander added. Because when people see that someone from my background and someone from Mr. E. Thompson's background can be real friends, not charity, not pity, but actual friendship, it makes them think differently about the barriers between different kinds of people. After the interview, Alexander and I walked Buddy through the neighborhood where my new apartment was located. It was a working-class area near the park, full of families and small businesses and people who worked hard for modest lives. I'd chosen it deliberately. I didn't want to live somewhere that would make me forget where I'd come from or how quickly circumstances can change. Mr. Thompson, Alexander said as we stopped at the small bodega where I bought groceries, I have something to tell you. What's that, son? I've been accepted to a summer program at Columbia University. It's for high school students interested in social work and public policy. I felt a surge of pride mixed with something that might have been worry. That's wonderful, Alexander. When does it start? Next month. I'll be in classes 4 days a week for 6 weeks, learning about poverty, homelessness, urban planning, all the things we've been talking about, but I'll still have time for our work at the Veterans Center. Your parents must be proud. They are, but they're also surprised. They keep asking me when I decided I wanted to work in social services instead of finance. Alexander grinned. I told them it was when I met a homeless veteran who taught me that success isn't about what you accumulate, but about what you contribute. As we near the end of Henry and Alexander's incredible journey, if this story has inspired you to think differently about homelessness or mentorship, please subscribe and share it with others who need to hear this message. That evening, the Morrison family had invited me to dinner at their penthouse, something that had become a monthly tradition. Eleanor always cooked my favorite Puerto Rican dishes, and we'd sit at the dining room table that had once seemed impossibly formal, but now felt like family. Henry, Catherine Morrison said as we finished dessert, David and I have been talking about the Foundation's next project. Oh, what did you have in mind? A mentorship program that pairs young people from privileged backgrounds with veterans who need support, transitioning back to civilian life. Not charity work, but genuine partnerships where both people benefit and learn from each other. David leaned forward. We'd like you to help design it, and we'd like Alexander to be one of the first participants when he turns 16. What would my role be? Training the young people, screening the veterans, facilitating the relationships, basically helping other kids have the kind of experience Alexander has had with you. I looked around the table, at David and Catherine, who'd gone from seeing me as a potential threat to treating me as family, at Elena, who'd embraced me with her characteristic warmth, at Alexander, who was practically bouncing in his chair with excitement about the new program. I think, I said slowly, that's exactly the kind of work I was meant to do. 2 weeks later, on a perfect June morning, Alexander and I returned to Central Park with Buddy for what had become our most important monthly ritual. We walked to the exact spot where I'd first found the scared, hungry golden retriever who'd changed both our lives. The bench looked the same, but everything else was different. Where I'd once seen only my own desperation and isolation, I now saw possibility and connection. Where Alexander had once seen only the guilt of letting his dog go, he now saw the beginning of his life's purpose. Mr. Thompson, Alexander said as we sat down, with Buddy contentedly sprawled across both our feet, do you think Buddy knew what would happen when he chose to trust you that first morning? I don't know if dogs can predict the future, I said, scratching behind Buddy's ears. But I think animals understand love and need in ways that sometimes humans miss. Buddy needed someone to take care of him, but he also knew I needed someone to take care of. Maybe that's not prediction. Maybe that's just wisdom. I used to come to this park and look at homeless people and feel sorry for them, Alexander admitted. I never thought about talking to them, getting to know them, learning from them. I just saw them as problems that other people should solve. And now I know that everyone has a story worth hearing. Everyone has something to teach if you're willing to learn. Everyone deserves to be seen as a person, not a problem. Alexander had grown into the kind of young man any parent would be proud of, but more importantly, he'd grown into the kind of person who would use his advantages to lift others up rather than just advancing himself. Watching him develop that character had been more rewarding than any success I'd achieved in my own life. Alexander, I said, I want you to know that these past months with you and your family have given me something I thought I'd lost forever. What's that? Hope, faith in the future, the knowledge that there are still good people in the world who care about doing the right thing. You gave me something too, Mr. Thompson. What? You showed me what it means to be a man. Not successful or wealthy or impressive, but honorable. Someone who takes responsibility for others, who faces hardship with dignity, who never stops caring about people even when life has been unfair to him. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the park come alive around us. Joggers, dog walkers, families with children, tourists taking photos, all the life and energy of New York City flowing past our quiet spot. Ready to head back? Alexander asked eventually. In a minute. I wanted to hold on to this moment, the three of us together in the place where it all began, surrounded by the promise of all the good work we still had ahead of us. Buddy stretched and yawned, then looked up at both of us with those wise golden eyes that had seen us through the transformation from strangers to family. His tail thumped once against the ground, his way of saying he was ready for whatever came next. Okay, boy, I said, standing up and feeling stronger than I had in years. Let's go home. As we walked back toward the busy streets of Manhattan, I reflected on the unexpected ways life can change. 6 months ago, I was just another invisible homeless veteran, counting down the days until the end. Now I was part of a family, mentor to young people who would shape the future and advocate for others who'd fallen through society's cracks. Mr. Thompson, Alexander said as we reached Fifth Avenue. Yes, son? Thank you for finding Buddy. But more than that, thank you for letting Buddy find you. I looked down at the golden retriever trotting happily between us, then at the remarkable young man walking beside me, and felt the kind of gratitude that changes everything. Thank you, Alexander, for seeing past what I looked like to who I really was, and for showing me that family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to care for each other. Thank you for joining us on Henry, Alexander, and Buddy's incredible journey of friendship, transformation, and hope. If their story has touched your heart like it's touched ours, please subscribe to our channel for more tales that celebrate the very best of human nature. Remember, every person you meet has a story worth knowing, and sometimes the most unlikely friendships create the most beautiful changes. The sun was setting behind the Manhattan skyline as we headed home. 3 lives that had intersected by chance and been transformed by choice, walking together toward a future full of purpose and possibility.